So totalitarianism, they always attack freedom of speech.
It's unnecessary.
Freedom of speech is not necessary inside.
Not if you're a totalitarian.
Right, because
it's
you know
like
everything.
You already know everything. You don't need any new ideas. Get the hell away from me with those.
And countless examples of totalitarians attacking the freedom of speech. Indeed, it's one of the first things they do.
Almost an unerring hallmark of the totalitarian mind.
And the other unerring hallmark is the central bank. So Marx's 1848 Manifesto of the Communist Party, measure number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly.
Yeah, that sounds like Marx. Jesus, what a dismal sentence that is.
Dismal.
How many people died because of that sentence?
100 million.
Tens of millions of people.
Over 100 million, right?
That sentence.
So,
Jesus.
So, on that note, welcome to class. This is our first lecture of the fall on Karl Marx the man. Not on his theories, not on his economic thoughts, which were all hot garbage, but on who he was as a person. Also, hot garbage. But I will be bringing receipts. That's the difference between this video, this lecture, and the other videos I've seen, particularly on YouTube. That's why this lecture is completely free. I am selling nothing. I am providing you information. This may be painful at times, only in that I don't want to just tell you I think that his ideas were bad and that he was and that he sucked. I want to read to you what he said. Okay? And we'll talk about it. So, welcome to class. Every lecture, I will be starting with a Soviet joke. And there's a very serious reason for this. These jokes survived gulags, okay? These jokes, when told in the Soviet Union, could destroy your life. Excuse me. They could destroy your life. And so I think in honor of the people who lived through that experience, I think we should tell these jokes. And just to piss off a few leftists, let's let Reagan tell one this time. Why not?
One of my visits, I won't name him, I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the heads of state that I met with on this visit, he gave me one while I was on the way. Told me the story about the two fellows in the Soviet Union that were walking down the street, and the one of them says, "Have we really achieved full communism? Is this it? Is this now full communism?" And the other one said, "Oh, hell no, things are going to get a lot worse."
A lot worse. Always. Every single time. Okay. So let's carry on.
I've been collecting stories that are told.
Sorry about that. Too much Reagan. So let's start with the basic biographical information. Heinrich Marx and Henrietta. Those were Karl's parents. They had 9 children, and they were both descended, both of his parents, from a long line of Jewish scholars, rabbis. They were not particularly religious. So what I mean by that is that Heinrich, Karl's dad, was more of a character of the Enlightenment, was a fan of Rousseau. The only nice thing I can say about Karl Marx at this point is that he was, in fact, a better parent than Rousseau, and that's not saying anything at all. Anywho, that's neither here nor there. So he's one of 9. He was born on May 4th, 1818, in Trier, which was at the time Prussia. So here's a map. If you look over bottom left on your screen, there's Trier. So near Belgium, France, Switzerland, down there towards the bottom. So this is where Karl was born. So, not the slums, right? His father was an attorney. So unfortunately, right around the time that Karl was born, the Prussian government said, if you were Jewish, you could not be an upper level attorney, which is what Karl's dad was. So when Karl was 6, the family converted to being Lutheran, or that's when he was baptized. His father may have converted first. Neither here nor there. And his mother actually waited a little bit. But all of their children were baptized as Lutherans. So between 1812 and 1846, and remember, Karl was born in 1818, 3,171 Jews in Prussia converted. So, like I said, 1824 was when they were baptized. At this point, when he was a younger child, he was actually homeschooled. So he grows up in this environment that's sort of liberal, permissive, and he has somewhat of a classical education. He goes to, that's where they moved in 1819. I'm getting ahead of myself. At the time, He went to a grammar school that was being raided by the Prussian authorities. So this is sort of a humanist, liberal environment. And Wittenbach, who is actually the person in charge of that school, was a friend of Karl's dad. So just to give you an idea of kind of the atmosphere he grew up in, notoriously sort of a butthole, kind of a bully, liked to laugh at the expense of others, not a great brother. This young woman, this unfortunate, sad woman, is Jenny. Jenny von Westphalen is the future wife of Karl. That house down in the bottom left is where she lived in Trier with her family, a higher class than Karl's family, okay? She was born to the north of Trier. And this is the person who kept the Marx family fed for the entirety of Marx's adult life. This is Friedrich Engels, born in 1820. And this, another sad woman in Marx's life, really all the women in Marx's life were sad. This is Helen Demuth, also known as Lynchen. So if you're reading about this period of time and you see this diminutive sort of chin at the end of names like Ginny Chin, Net Chin, this is sort of like a diminutive nicknamey type of thing. And they called her Lynchen. This at the time she was a young woman, actually she was a child, I'm being too kind. She was a child when she went into domestic service because her father, a baker, had died. So she was a domestic laborer in Jenny's household when Jenny was growing up. So Jenny was born in 1814, if you remember from the previous slides. And Lynchen, we'll call her Lynchen, was born in 1820, so a little bit younger than her. And so they grow up together in a household where she's a domestic servant. This is the Jesuit church and grammar school, Jesuit nonsense, where Karl got his education as a young man. And if you look at the slide, and I'll have to post these slides somewhere if anyone's interested, Johann Hugo Wittenbach, friend of his father. By employing many liberal humanists as teachers, he incurred the anger of the local conservative government, and the police began raiding the school. Helen Demuth, this is an older picture of her, obviously, started working for the Westphalen family in 1831, so she would have been 11. She began working as a domestic servant, period, at the age of 7 after her father died. So this is very small writing, so let me help you. 1835, he goes to the University of Bonn. Okay, so this is not a rigorous school. He sort of engages in like drinking, partying, writing horrific poetry, which I'm sorry for you, you will have to hear me read soon. There is sort of a story that you can read online that says he got into a duel before he was moved to a different school. I don't know that that actually happened. There's a note that he was accused of carrying a prohibited weapon. I think from all the things I've seen, he was an absolute a-hole to people, but I don't know that he actually got into a duel. Either way, total schmuck. Okay, so he secretly got engaged to Jenny in 1836. Now, keep in mind, at the time, she was married to somebody who was more socially acceptable, right? Sort of her same class that she kiboshed for Marx. A very bad idea. As there was no point up to now that Marx showed any sort of seriousness of like he was going to take care of a woman. So anyway, they're secretly engaged, 1836. In October of that year, they got engaged in August. In October, he transferred to the University of Berlin, which is a really important part of his formation as an atheist, as a critic. This is actually a picture of the University of Berlin. So in 1837, these are the first of the letters that I will be engaging with you. So he got a letter from his dad. So this letter, you can see how much I've absolutely torn up these books. So this is March 2nd, 1837. So his dad, who's basically paying his bills, he's sending him to school. He sends this on March 2nd, 1837. This is Heinrich. At times my heart delights in thinking of you and your future, and yet at times I cannot rid myself of ideas which arouse in me sad forebodings and fear when I am struck as if by lightning by the thought, is your heart in accord with your head and your talents? So at the end of this, Will you ever, and that is not the least painful doubt of my heart, will you ever be capable of truly human domestic happiness? No, Heinrich. Will, and this doubt has no less tortured me recently, since I have come to love a certain person like my own child. I'm going to assume this is Jenny, who he's engaged to. Will you ever be capable of imparting happiness to those immediately around you? Now, that is an enormously harsh statement from a parent who is obviously deeply worried about their child, because all evidence at this point shows that he's a fairly selfish, ridiculous person, and he cares about the woman that he's engaged to. Okay, so November 10th of the same year, Karl is 19, and he sends his father this lengthy, angsty teenage letter where he's talking about how he's up all night and he's writing poetry and he has all these grand ideas, and it's an 1830s angst-ridden, embarrassing letter, okay, that he sends home to his parents. So, and they're still in Trier at the time, and Karl is in Berlin. So I want you to think about, oh gosh, it's pages and pages and pages. I will not bore you with the entire thing. But he's talking about the magic of his poems. Alas, the stroke was a shattering one at first. The realm of true poetry shone at me like a distant fairy palace, and thus all my own creations dissolved into nothingness. You can just imagine pages and pages of this. Believe me, my dear, beloved father, this is not a selfish wish. Although I would be blissful to see Jenny again, I am rather motivated by a thought which I may not put into words. In some respects, it would be difficult for me to come, and yet, as my own sweet Jenny writes, such considerations must give way to the fulfillment of duties which are sacred. He was drinking a lot at college. Nothing that important was happening. So anyway, imagine he sends this pages and pages, and he ends with, I remain your ever-loving son, Karl. Forgive me, dear father, the illegible handwriting and the bad style. It is nearly 4 o'clock. The candle has burned out completely, and my eyes are blurred. A true restlessness has taken hold of me. I shall not be able to mollify the specters haunting me until I am in your dear presence. That sounds all very important, doesn't it? His father sends him a somewhat sad response. So this response is the mood in which I find myself is in reality less than poetic. They've been sick. They've had cholera. He has not asked any questions about them. He has not visited. He is spending all of this money essentially partying and acting like an idiot. Often we have been for months without a letter, and the last one was when you knew that Edward was sick, your mother suffering, I ailing, and cholera raging in Berlin, and as if all this did not even require an apology, your next letter did not mention a word about any of this, but contained a few poorly written lines and an extract from a diary entitled Visit, which frankly I would have rather shown the door than received. A crazy concoction that only proved how you squander your talents and stayed up nights to produce monsters, that you followed in the footsteps of the new fiends who screw up their words so that they cannot hear themselves, that a deluge of words reflecting no ideas or merely disordered ones are christened a product of genius. Dang, that is brutal. Basically, he is telling him, you absolutely suck. He ends this talking about how much money he has given him, how much he has wasted, how is he spending this much. So anyway, brutal response. This is in 1837. He's still at college. He's been engaged a year. Let's move forward. Well, let's forgive him for being 19 and kind of an idiot. I too was an idiot at 19. I don't know that my parents ever wrote me a letter that brutal, but you have to remember the context of that is that he's a spoiled brat. So they've been telling him, you know, it's not like he's got mean parents. They've been really encouraging him, giving him money, trying to see him set up in life so that he can have a wife and have a good life, and he is being a jackass. Okay, so brutal. Poems. He got into poetry. He wanted to be a poet. The problem was he was a bad poet. So he did publish these. I think he had 2 that I've read that were published. A lot of them he sent to his dad. Love poems. One of the weirdest things about his love poems is that they are often about like people killing each other, suicide pacts, the devil, violence, apocalyptic visions, Satan, like really kind of disturbing stuff. It's interesting to note that 2 of his daughters that survived him both commit suicide by poison, which he liked to write about. Stabbing women, really sweet stuff. So I'm going to read this to you. Bear with me. It is painful. The cringe is real. His voice is muffled low. Desperate, he looks about. Glances of crackling flame, his hollow eyes shoot out. You have drunk poison, love. With me you must away. The sky is dark above. No more I see the day. I wrote better poetry when I was 12. Shuddering, he pulls her close to him. Death in the breast doth hover. Pain stabs her, piercing deep within, and eyes are closed forever. That's supposed to be, so they have a suicide pact. Interesting. His daughters did this. How so? I plunge without fail, my blood black saber into your soul. Thou art God, neither wants nor wists. It leaps to the brain from hell's black mists. Till heart's bewitched, till senses reel. With Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me. I play the death march, fast and free. Ladies, if a man writes you poems like this and tells you that he's in love with you, get a whole new man. Painful. So, 1838. Heinrich dies. So he writes this letter in December. Within the next few months, he dies at 68 of tuberculosis. Take a wild guess if Karl bothered to go to his funeral. This is a theme for him. No, he didn't. So in the Communist Manifesto, which we will get into in the next lecture, he does mention how he doesn't believe that there should be inheritance, which is odd because he did get some inheritance from his dad. The next year, in 1839, he took a lecture on the book of Isaiah from Bruno Bauer. Now, Bruno Bauer will be a formative character for him and his beliefs. Bruno Bauer they were occasional roommates. They got into some shenanigans. But I love this quote about him in a biography that he was unsavory, nasty, radical, anti-Semite, openly atheistic, which means they were really perfect for each other because all of those same things could be applied to Karl himself. 1841, he finishes at school in Berlin. He actually submitted his doctoral thesis to a different university that had lower standards because his university deemed it too controversial, aka trash, and didn't give him a PhD. But he did get one from another institution. He then spent July to October, and this is in 1841, with Bruno Bauer. He wanted to be a professor. That didn't work out. No shock there. One thing to note at this point, it's 1841. He's been engaged to Jenny since 1836. She left a man who was ready to marry her for him, still not married, still doesn't have a real job. 1842, he starts writing. There's a newspaper in German is Zeitung. I might be saying that wrong. I speak Russian, not German, so forgive me. That originally the editor was Moses Hess. He took over, so he moved to Cologne. March 1842, Bauer was fired from his university. No shock there. He was a piece of trash. I mean, he was. He acted out in petty ways. So they spent that Easter of that year, 1842, mind you, right after Jenny's own father had died that year in 1842, mocking Christ at Easter time as a joke, kind of to be petty to get back at the, the whole world, riding donkeys through this village to mock the passion of Christ. Anyway, November, he meets Frederick Engels for the first time in the offices. So Engels was born into a wealthier family, a capitalist family, in the textile industry. And he was hanging out with this German liberal atheist crew, and his parents were like, no, thank you. So they sent him to Manchester, and on the way there, he actually met Karl for the first time at the Zeitung office. This will be an important figure in Marx's life. 1843, Karl is now unemployed because the authorities shut down his newspaper. He resigned, and he got married in this Protestant church in Kreuznach. Again, not saying I speak German. It sounds like Christ. I don't know. I'm not even going to try. In June of that year. So he's got no job. Okay. He marries this woman who, whatever, she's made her choices. No one in Marx's family attends. No big shock. 2 people from Jenny's family attend. And in October, they moved to Paris. 1844, we're in Paris. This guy right here is a really important person to me when I'm looking at what Marx is about. February, as always, he's publishing these radical papers wherever he goes. So he's doing this in France, in Paris. And in March, he meets Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. At the time, his daughter Jenny was born. Yes, Jenny, daughter of Jenny, in May. In August, he meets Engels again. They spend 10 days together, and they become friends at this point. So he's in the French radical scene. He's writing. One of the fascinating things about Marx is how little time he spent, and by little I mean none, with the people he wrote about. So he was writing about this group of weavers from a region up north and their plight. Did he speak to them? No. Did he go visit them? No. 1845. So this is going to be a theme for the Marxes forever. Them getting kicked out of places. So they're kicked out of France and they go to Brussels. This happened in mid-January. So they've just had a baby, right? And they're getting kicked out of France. So February they moved to Brussels. In February he's working on something called the Holy Family, which we'll touch on as well in our next lecture. But what I want you to know, this is important. April of this year, Lynching is given to the Marxes by Jenny's family, Westphalen family. So she's 22 years old. They're concerned about her. She's with this crazy man. They've been kicked out of Paris. They're struggling. He still has no real job, and they're being deported. So they send her a domestic servant, one they will never pay. Okay, we'll get there. Their next child was born in September, Laura, in Brussels. And that December, Marx gave up his Prussian citizenship. Prussia being, if you remember, where he was born. 1846, he completes the German ideology. And there's a quote. This actually wasn't officially published until the 1960s, but there's a quote that I like. I don't like the quote, but I think it's telling. From the German ideology. For the widespread generation of the communist consciousness and for the success of the cause, it is necessary that man himself should suffer mass change. Suffering being the operative word here. You don't have to be Catholic to take this class. I am Catholic, and so occasionally I will bring that into my lectures. 1846, Pope Pius IX released an encyclical about communism, stating that it is absolutely contrary to the natural law, and if adopted, it would utterly destroy the rights, property, and possessions of all men and even society itself. I mean, he seems to have pretty much hit the nail on the head with that one. In this encyclical, he refers to communism as an unspeakable doctrine. So 1847, we're still in Brussels at this point. We haven't been kicked out yet. That's coming, as always. He's writing for, again, radical publications in Brussels. In June, organizes the German Communist League with Engels. In August, founds the German Workers' Association with Engels to spread communist ideology. Do you think that the authorities enjoyed that? No. November 29th to December 8th, participated in the London Congress of the Communist League and was commissioned for the Communist Manifesto. So mindful, and I think as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, I read this and I think about his wife. So she's heavily pregnant back in Brussels. He gets back just in time for the birth of their third child, Edgar. That's in December. So 1848 is the year that the Communist Manifesto, a book that we will cover extensively, is published. This on the left is actually the only bit of the, I'm completely forgetting the word. what is the word? Oh, the rough draft. Oh my gosh, my brain. This is the only bit of the rough draft that we have. Handwritten by Mr. Marx himself. 1848, revolution breaks out in France. So 1848 is an important year, not only because that's when the Communist Manifesto came out, but that there were several attempted revolutions that were going on throughout Europe. So because revolution broke out in France, and in February the manifesto began being published in London, the provisional French government welcomed Marx to come back, which was great timing because on March 3rd, they got expelled from Brussels. And in fact, Ginny, also his wife, and Karl spent the night in jail. At this time, Ginny has a 2-month-old baby, Edgar, and a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. And she's spending the night in jail because Karl can't get a real job. Or refuses. Okay, March 5th, they get back to Paris. Or Karl gets back to Paris. At which point he's elected in March, the president of the Communist League. So throughout that year, we've got revolution breaking out, upheaval in Berlin, in Hungary. In March, he writes the demands of the Communist Party in Germany with Engels again. So, another Zeitung. We're back to the Zeitungs, okay? The new one, the organ of democracy, which ran from 1848 to 1849. And then an outbreak of revolution happened in Cologne in September of that year. December, he gets indicted on charges of incitement of rebellion because he was literally doing that. 1849, a jury of his peers acquitted him of doing the thing he was most certainly doing, and they were expelled from Prussia. So this was in May. This is 1849. This is the year after the Communist Manifesto was published. So the next slide, I'll actually show it, but Marx publishes in May the last of this this new newspaper in red, and said a quote in this that I see around now attributed to him: "When our turn comes, we will not make excuses for the terror." So he was a bit in his feelings about the whole situation. It was one of those effort and a find out situations. I'm not sure why he was so surprised. Anywho, he goes back to Paris. This is in June. They're living in abject poverty. Okay, so the kind of poverty where you have pawned everything you own up to and including your pants. Like, I mean, literally. There were times I couldn't leave the house because he'd pawned their clothes. They have nothing. Nothing. And then in July, they're then expelled from France. France is tired of your nonsense. That was fast, right? So on September 5th, and we'll read this together, he is in London. Okay, they've been expelled, or he's been expelled. They've given Ginny a little bit more time. Again, she's heavily pregnant. Let's see. Page 61. This book is a collection of his letters. Like I said, we don't just believe the guy was a piece of trash. We want to read it for ourselves. So he writes this to a friend. He's staying in London with some guy named Karl Blind, and he wants the letter care of a coffee house. So he's got cholera. This is another theme. He's going to be sick forever. There's a boil. There's a liver problem. He's got a tumor forever. But right now he has cholera. And he is talking about how that the Paris police have harassed my wife. And she has managed to remain in Paris until September 15th, the date up to which we have rented our apartment. I am now in a truly difficult situation. My wife is very pregnant. She must leave Paris on the 15th, and I don't know where I can raise the money needed for her trip and for lodgings here. On the other hand, I have every expectation of being able to begin a monthly review here, but time presses, and the first weeks are the really difficult ones. So somebody gave him some money, probably Engels, or maybe this guy he was writing to. And Jenny did get there in London on September 17th, and in November on the 5th, their next child, this is their 4th child, that because he was born on Guy Fawkes Day, his nickname was Foxchin. And at this point, they're in Leicester Square living in a boarding house. So again, abject poverty, 4th child. They also have a slave, and by that I mean quite literally a live-in domestic servant that is not paid, which we call a slave. that was given to them as a present. So keep that in mind. That's an important detail. So here we go. This is his red ink, drama queen, Zeitung. Bye-bye. Leave the country. We're sick of you. Bye, Karl. 1850 in London. They get evicted from their boarding house along with their 4 kids under 7. This is in April. And there is a report from a Prussian spy on what it was like inside their home. Prepare yourself. This is ridiculous. Marx leads the existence of a bohemian intellectual. Washing, grooming, and changing his linen are things he does rarely, and he is often drunk. Though he is frequently idle for days on end, he will work day and night with tireless endurance when he has much work to do. He has no fixed time for going to sleep or waking up. He often stays up all night and then lies down, fully clothed, on the sofa at midday and sleeps till evening, untroubled by the whole world coming and going through their room. There were only 2 of those altogether. There is not one clean and solid piece of furniture. Everything is broken, tattered, and torn, with half an inch of dust over everything, and the greatest disorder everywhere. In the middle of the living room, there is a large old-fashioned table covered with oilcloth, and on it lie manuscripts, books, and newspapers, as well as the children's toys, rags and tatters of his wife's sewing basket, several cups with chipped rims, knives, forks, lamps, an inkpot, tumblers, Dutch clay pipes, tobacco ash. A junk shop owner would be ashamed to give away such a remarkable collection of odds and ends. When you enter Marx's room, smoke and tobacco fumes make your eyes water. A lovely place for 4 small children. Everything is dirty and covered with dust, so that to sit down becomes a hazardous business. Here is a chair with 3 legs. On another chair, the children are playing at cooking. This chair happens to have 4 legs. This is the one that is offered to the visitor, but the children's cooking has not been wiped away, and if you sit down, you risk a pair of trousers. So it doesn't sound like the most pleasant place to be, but they're broke, and Karl's definitely not going to get a job. So in July, he starts, I'm going to use this word generously, working at the reading room at the British Museum, because he wants to publish his book Capital that he plans on being several volumes. We never get there. October 29th, still in 1850, he wrote a letter to his friend telling him that he had pawned everything, including even the children's things, okay? He's pawned it all. At some point in the fall of this year, whilst he is pawning even the baby's things, he gets Lynchen pregnant. Ginny had gone to Holland, this is probably when it happened if you look at the dates, to beg family for money because they were broke. Lynchen fell pregnant. Now, this is something that sticks in my craw, as it were. Marx's talk about how, and I'll read a quote actually from a book written by a fan, about how we can't know. We cannot know if she consented to this. I think that we can know because the options for her were limited, as she was an unpaid servant, aka a slave, living with people who were themselves living in poverty. Okay? So you can't consent to something like that in this environment. I don't know why I would have to explain that to anyone. Okay? The same way we all understand Thomas Jefferson had children with a slave. If you're a slave, she couldn't have consented, even if she, we all understand this until we start talking about somebody that we think is a genius, and all of a sudden, well, maybe she loved him. Okay, well, he didn't love her enough to pay her to wash his, whatever. Well, I'm kidding. He didn't wash anything. You know what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying. Okay. November of this year, he's knocked up the slave. Their baby Foxton dies of an intestinal problem. The first of the children to die. Will not be the last, unfortunately. At this point, Ingalls actually decided to do some work for his dad. Again, this capitalist, factory owner type guy, to help them himself and then help Marx pay his bills. This is actually a picture of the reading room at the British Museum, which is just absolutely stunning, so I thought I would include it. 1851, March, their baby Frances was born. This is not Lynchen. He had also gotten Ginny, his wife, pregnant. Her baby was born first. And This baby, according to writing that Jenny did in 1865, was boarded out to a wet nurse. Quote, "We gave the poor little thing to a nurse, for we could not rear her with the 3 others in 3 small rooms." This is 4 months after the loss of their son. And mind you, the servant is heavily pregnant. June, so very soon after, Freddie is born to Lynchen and is fostered out and disappeared to a working class family very soon after. So again, we have people that can't figure out that this isn't okay. For example, Love and Capital by Mary Gabriel. I was stunned by this version that she provides us of what happened with Lynchen. "It would be easy to blame Marx alone for such an unforgivable act of betrayal. Let me stop you there. It would be very easy, correct. But that would ascribe a timidity and vulnerability to Lynchen that were not reflected in her character. How would you know that? She was a slave. Did she leave something in any evidence for that, or are you just hoping that's the case because this is somebody you're a fan of? Perhaps Marx and Lynchen were drinking, a favorite recreation for them both. Well, in that case, or he was in need of consolation because Jenny was away and Ingalls was preparing to leave, so he simply turned to Lynchen," end quote, my emphasis added to the following statement, "and raped her." Rape is what happens when you have sex with someone who cannot consent. Thank you. I'm sorry I had to clarify that for you. Wrote a whole book and had the audacity to include this. Vomit. Disgusting. In August of that year, he was invited to write for the New York Daily Tribune. £2 an article. And totally published 321 articles for them. And when I say he, I mean oftentimes Ingalls ghost wrote for him because he would have a boil on his butt and be like, "I can't work. Can you write it for me? Also, I need money because I'm not working." And Ingalls was like, "Okay." 1852. The child, the original Frances, who was born prior to Lynchen's baby, died with a nurse. Remember this nurse. She'll come up again. There's nothing in the letters that I found that seems to be that Marx was too concerned about this. She's not even listed, and along with another child, in a lot of his biographies. September 8th, 1852. He sends a letter to Ingalls that I will now share. Page 84. "Your letter arrived today in a very agitated atmosphere, September 8th, 1852. To Frederick Ingalls. My wife is ill. Jenny Chin is ill. Lynchen has a sort of hysteria, perhaps brought on by the fact that you've stolen the child that you... Okay, let me stop. I cannot and could not call the doctor because I have no money for medicine. For the past 8 to 10 days, I have been feeding the family on bread and potatoes, and it is questionable whether I can get any more today. When I visited you and you told me that up to the end of August you would be able to procure for me a somewhat larger sum, I wrote that to my wife to ease her mind. Get a job, Karl. Your letter of 3 or 4 weeks ago indicated that there was not much prospect of this, so I postponed paying all creditors, who, as you know, are always paid in small sums, until early September. Now the storm has broken loose. I've tried everything but in vain. First, the dog of Wademeyer took me for £15. Okay, Karl, I know you're an economist, but let me help you with this. When you take out a loan and have debt, they expect you to pay it back. I wrote to Germany to Straight. The animal did not even answer. I turned to Brockhaus to offer him an article. He refused very politely. The best and most desirable thing that could happen would be for the landlady to throw me out of the house. I would then at least be quit for the sum of £25, but so much favor I cannot expect from her. In addition, I still owe the baker, the milkman, the tea fellow, the greengrocer, and an old debt to the butcher. What am I to do with all this devil's muck? Get a job, Karl. Finally, what is to me the most dreadful? In the past 8 to 10 days, out of necessity, in order to not croak, I have borrowed shillings and pence from Philistines. At no point from this moment forward will he ever get less pathetic. So if that was embarrassing to you, brace yourself. November, dissolution of the Communist League. 1853 and 1854. It'll shock you to learn that he spent the entire time writing about being sick, broke, and entirely self-obsessed. Let's learn.
Marx suffered bad health, in particular a painful skin condition. New research suggests that what he referred to as boils was in fact something far more serious.
Well, I read an account of his life. It was quite an interesting book, but it said he suffered really quite badly from a skin complaint. Naturally, I picked up my ears, and they said that he couldn't find a place to rest. He couldn't lie down. He couldn't walk. For 3 weeks at one point, he was totally unable to work, totally unable to think.
As opposed to all the other times when he wasn't
the
working.
Skin complaint they said that he was suffering from was just boils. Well, boils are a bit of a nuisance, but they're not that bad. And I looked at Marx's letters over a period of about 9 years.
So
bit tedious. But you could see from these letters, he gets them in the groins. He gets them around
He's
the
real
anus.
specific, bro.
And then, very diagnostically, under the arms. Now, this distribution only occurs in one disease. It's a thing called hidradenitis suppurativa,
Right.
a rather terrible, unpronounceable name.
It sounds
Very.
as though it's very debilitating physically.
Absolutely. Here's, for example, an armpit. It's scarred where there's been repeated
Wes,
episodes.
if you have
It
this, I'm so
never
sorry.
really stands still.
Did we know when he...
Okay, so I found that interesting. Yeah, something to think about. 1855. He's writing for the Zeitung. He writes 112 articles for him or Engels that last until October, and then in January, Eleanor is born. He's sad she's a girl. That does depress him. Again, I hate to read all of these to you, but I don't want people to think that I'm just editorializing. You know, he literally just says these things. Okay. I could not, of course, write for the Tribune today, and also not for some time to come, because yesterday, between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning, my wife gave birth to a bona fide traveler. Alas, the sex par excellence. Had it been a male child, the whole thing would have been nicer. Okay. April, Edgar dies. Their second child to die. Nope, third child to die. At 8 years old. He'd been ill, and they thought he was getting better, but then he passed. In September, Marx uses his son's death to try to manipulate family out of money. And I say that he's using this because let me read you this letter he sent to Engels. So this was in March. A very happy event. The death of my wife's 90-year-old uncle was reported to us yesterday. Thereby, my mother-in-law saves an annual contribution of 200, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, thaler, it's some sort of currency. And my wife will receive 100 pounds. And more if the old dog did not bequeath to his housekeeper part of the money that is not entailed. This is the guy that's supposed to be the champion of the working class. Okay. So he writes, my dear Frau Daniels. So he says, I know enough of your heroic nature to be convinced that the imperishable pain of loss of her husband will not prevent you from continuing to be a faithful guardian of the previous commitments left by your Roland. The news of this loss has so vividly reawakened my wife's remembrance of the death of our own little son that her state of mind does not permit her to write to you. She weeps and wails like a child. Yeah, gross. Okay. February 13th, now we're in 1856. Remember that nurse that Francis, the baby who died, went to? Well, I'm imagining this is who he was talking about. He writes this letter to Engels, February 13th, 1856. A few days ago, Piper was in the house here and gave the children instruction. That's not the nurse. Wait, this is a guy. When the postman knocked downstairs, a letter to Piper in a feminine handwriting, invitation to a rendezvous. This is like Tinder for the 1850s. Since he did not know the handwriting or the signature, he cradled himself in great expectations and gave my wife the letter to read. She immediately recognized the signature as that of the fat old Irish pig, our former wet nurse, who does not know how to write, and hence it had been written by a third person. You can imagine with what laughter our Piper was tickled. Nevertheless, he kept his rendezvous with the cow. Such are his adventures. What an ox you are. When people tell me that he championed the rights of women, I want to throw up in my mouth. Anywho, September, they got a nicer home. They upgraded. I don't know how they were broke. For a £26 rental at Maitland Park. 4 days later, he couldn't pay rent and had pawned everything. I literally don't understand. He said rent. Oh, I'm sorry. Typo, £36. Even nicer than I thought. Moving on September 29th. This week it is to be furnished. We're in a bit of a quandary. Since we have to pay about £26 in the city and much more for the new furnishings. That's where I got 26. That is, we're short £10 to £15, even if momentarily, as my wife is to receive a yet larger sum from her brother in Berlin as a result of her inheritance. Yesterday he wrote that he could not yet send the money. If you could supply a part of the shortfall, I'm thinking of raising the rest in the pawn shop until the Berlin money arrives. The bad thing is there's no time to lose. Again, world-famous economist, you mean to tell me that he rented the place and 4 days later realized, oh, wait, I don't have the funds to pay for this. I don't want to be told what he thinks about money or anything about economics. He could not pay any of his bills. Okay. Let's carry on. 1857. Oh, this is a hard one for me. Jenny is pregnant, has a baby. Again, I mean, this poor woman. And the baby, I can't quite tell if the baby just dies immediately or is stillborn. But Karl's response to this is so gross. He sends this to Frederick Engels. This is July 8th, the day the baby was born. Dear Frederick, my wife has finally had her confinement, but the child was not viable. It died immediately. Okay, there's my answer. In and by itself, this is no misfortune. What an absolute bastard. So the entire year, 1857, he spends the year being belligerent about having to repay debts, constantly annoyed. He borrows from everyone and is consistently peeved when they want the money back. It makes no sense. He's angry about taxes. He's begging for money. The boils are a consistent theme. He's always saying where they are, which is so gross. And pawning all of his wife's belongings. And being too sick to work. Okay. 1858. I mean, I can't put all of them because I don't want this to be a 14-hour journey. We're in 1858 now. And mind you, he is, what is he, 40 years old at this point? He's 40, yeah. He was born 1818. Okay. The great coal that is set in here and the actual lack of coal in our home forced me, although of all things in the world, this is for me the most disagreeable, to press you again. In short, if this condition continues, I would rather lie 100 fathoms deep underground than go on vegetating like this. Always to be a burden on others and constantly to be harassed by the pettiest muck. It is unendurable in the long run. I personally work off the misery through intense occupation with ordinary things. My wife, of course, does not have the same resources. Just so obnoxious. You have been begging forever. You're 40 years old. Someone explain this to me. July. February through May, he says he's too sick to work. He needs help working. Poor Ingalls. What a dummy. Keeps helping. What is he doing in July of that year? Still begging. Dear Ingalls, I beg you, to begin with, not to be alarmed by the content of this letter, since it is in no way an appeal to the already indecent claims on your purse. On the other hand, it is necessary to take counsel together to see if some solution could be found to the present situation. Get a job, bum, which is absolutely no longer tenable. Just like every other letter you've sent. I lose the best part of my time in running around in vain attempts to raise money, and partly because my power of thinking no longer holds out, perhaps as a consequence of a further decline in health and the lamentations in the house. My wife's nerves are shattered by this muck. So anyway, he's talking about getting loans. In order that you have a real insight into the situation, I have had my wife make out an account of how we spent the £20 that you have advanced me and the £24, of which 2 were overdrawn, which I received from the Tribune. So then he gives this fascinating account, where is it, of his budget. Now, I've read this several times, and I can't figure out where in this budget he's paying the slave. Oh, wait, he doesn't pay her. So all of this, the pawn shop, the school, the butcher, the baker. Okay, he says after June 17th, there was not a penny in the house. And in order to pay the daily expenses for the last 4 weeks, which had to be paid in cash, we had to borrow £4 from Shaper, of which, however, we had to spend £2 for the miscarried loan operation fees. I would like you to pay attention to this. I know this is brutal. If I should take the step of reducing the expenses to an extreme, for example, take the children out of school, move into purely proletarian quarters, dismiss the maids, live on potatoes, even the auctioning off of my furniture would not bring enough to satisfy even the neighboring creditors so that I could slip away unhindered into some hiding place. The show of respectability which has been maintained hitherto had been the only means of preventing collapse. For my part, I would even ask the devil if only I could find a peaceful hour to pursue my work, even if I had to live in Whitechapel. But for my wife in her present state, such a change would have dangerous consequences, and for the growing girls, too, it would be hardly appropriate. So he can't live like the poors. That would be inappropriate, obviously. Okay. 1859. What's he doing? Can anyone guess? The unfortunate manuscript is completed, but cannot be mailed because I don't have a farthing to prepay and insure it. I cannot buy stamps. If you could send me £2, it would be very welcome, as I have postponed some absolutely no longer postponable demands from small creditors until Monday. This is the most obnoxious. This is, I've skipped ahead. This is December 1858. Here in the house, it looks more dreary and desolate than ever, since my wife could not herself prepare a Christmas celebration for the children, but instead is being pursued by demand notes from all sides, and works on the manuscript in addition, and has to run to the pawn shop in the city in between times. The atmosphere is extraordinarily gloomy. Moreover, my wife is quite right when she says that after all the misery she has had to endure already, it will be even worse after the revolution, and she will have the dubious pleasure of seeing all the humbugs from here on out celebrate their triumphs. Women are like that. Okay. Little bit crazy. So 1859, interestingly, November, the first edition of The Origin of Species comes out. And Darwin was somebody that he admired, it sounds like, and wanted to put his book capital in honor to him, and Darwin's family was like, no thanks. Anyway, this first edition, there was 1,250 copies in the first run printing, and Ingalls got one. 3 weeks later, he wrote to Marx saying, Darwin, by the way, who I'm reading just now, is absolutely splendid. There was one aspect of teleology that had not been demolished, and that has now been done. So a year later, Marx read it himself. Teleology, the doctrine of design and purpose in the material world. Marx thought of himself as a scientist. It was important to him that he thought that almost like he had taken the evolution of man, evolution of species, and applied the same science to society and economics. Obviously, that's not the case, but that's how he thought of himself. (1859) Engels, if it were possible for you to send some money, I would be very much obliged. The lousy guy, Dunker, on whom I counted, seems to have postponed the matter into the blue yonder. The beast has sent me nothing for the last 11 days. Self-awareness party of absolutely zero. Okay. 1860, Jenny got smallpox, and by some accounts, no longer looked the same. And Marx wrote a letter to Engels about Darwin's natural selection that I think is interesting, but I've been going for almost an hour, and he's going to be annoying for like 20 more years, so let's pass that up. 1861, he attempts to get his Prussian citizen back, and per a letter that he wrote his aunt, he was refused this due to his, quote, political notoriety. They were like, don't come back. Thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. He begins working on Capital, his magnum opus, in June. 1861, page 154. What do you think he's doing? What do you think? Any guesses? Any guesses? He's begging. Engels, December 9th, 1861. With the last money you sent me, to which I added another borrowed pound. He's borrowing a single pound, which obviously is more than it is now, but you get the point. I paid the school tuition so as to not have to pay double in January. The butcher, the grocer have forced me to give them promissory notes, one for 10 pounds and the other for 12 pounds to fall due in January. Although I did not know how I would pay them then, I could not refrain from doing it without having the whole household collapse over my head. I owe the landlord 15 pounds now and 21 in January. Ditto the greengrocer, baker, newspaper dealer, milkman, and all the rabble whom I have appeased with part payment since my return from Manchester. What I owe, including interest to the pawn shop, amounts to 100 pounds. Yeah. 1862. This is probably, I can't imagine writing this about a spouse, but he writes this. This is to Engels, June 1862. It is most loathsome on my part to regale you again with my misery. I don't think it is at this point. Okay. But what to do? My wife says to me every day that she wishes she and the children were dead. And I cannot really blame her. For the humiliations, harassments, and terrors that one experiences in this situation are in fact indescribable. The 50 pounds were, as you know, spent on debts, of which I could hardly pay half. 2 pounds for gas. The lousy money from Vienna will not arrive before the end of July, and then it will be too damn little, as the dogs don't print even one article per week now. Can you imagine your wife saying, I would rather be dead along with our children than deal with this nonsense anymore? He, that year, attended a lecture by a Darwin supporter. 1863. Mary Burns, who was not the wife of Engels because he wasn't really a traditional feller, died. And Marx wrote to him after this happened. They'd been together for this whole time that he was married to Jenny. And by that, I mean Mary Burns and Engels. And he wrote this one line at the beginning of this letter in January. The news of Mary's death has surprised and dismayed me. She was very good-natured, witty, and devoted to you. Immediately after, the devil knows that nothing but trouble happens in our circle. And then he goes on to complain about 15 pounds. So after this letter, Engels, this was a skosh too far for him because he loved this woman. And he wrote back and made the point that basically, like, wow, somebody I love died and you're not, that's not a normal response. So he had to then kind of grovel after that because, again, this guy's keeping you fed, housed, all the things. And you are clearly the world's worst friend. February to May, too sick to work. I don't know why I have to keep repeating that, but that's what he's saying. I'm too sick to work. You know, so in just November, his mother dies. Again, he has published, at this point, it's been since 48 that he published that inheritance shouldn't exist. He gets an attorney to make sure he gets as much inheritance from her as possible. And in a letter, the only thing he ever says about it, he doesn't go to her funeral, nothing like that. He just says that the old woman is dead. Touching, right? That would be December 2nd, yes. Let's see. His mother, who kept him from starving to death and put him through college and blah, 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 blah. I am at any rate more oh my God, this is so annoying. 2 hours ago, I received a telegram that my mother is dead. Fate claimed one of my family. I myself stood with one foot in the grave. Under present circumstances, I am at any rate more necessary than the old woman. For what? I must go to Trier to settle my inheritance. To settle my inheritance. Marx says, to settle my inheritance. I must beg you, and then he ends this, I must beg you, Engels, to send me by return mail enough money so that I can immediately take the trip. He didn't, okay. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. 2 days later, he said, thanks for the 10 pounds, ditto belatedly for the port wine. 1864, new house. They've upgraded again. Has boils, ill health. He goes to Ramsgate. You know, back then they used to go like on health holiday and go get some sea air or whatever. He's doing that. September 28th, the first meeting of the International Working Men's Association. And he's chosen a member of the Provisional Committee. Bakunin is going to come back into this. In October, they drafted provisional rules in the inaugural address of the First International. And then he got some more inheritance from an uncle. Some more what, Marxist? Inheritance from an uncle. 1865, in July, he writes an astonishing letter that I will now read to you. To Engels. For 2 months, I have lived entirely on the pawn shop. I mean, it never ends, right? It never ends. He was born in 1818. He is a grown man. For 2 months now, I have lived entirely on the pawn shop and have been exposed daily to piled up and increasingly unbearable stormy demands. This fact will not surprise you when you realize that 1, throughout this whole period, I have been unable to earn a farthing, and 2, that the mere paying off of my debts and the furnishing of the house, the new house, cost me about £500. This is a huge amount of money back then. I have kept a record, pence for pence, as to this time, because it was incredible for me how much money disappeared. I bet it was. In addition, all kinds of antediluvian demands were made of me from Germany, where they spread God knows what news about me. I assure you I would rather have cut off my thumb than to write you this letter. It is truly shattering to have remained dependent half of one's life, all of one's life. The only thought that keeps me going is that we two are running a joint partnership to which I contribute my time for theoretical and party business. What a joke. I do indeed live too expensively for my conditions. No shit. And furthermore, this year I have lived better than usual. But it is the only means whereby the children, apart from the fact that they have suffered so much from you, and for which they have been compensated for at least a short period, can maintain contacts and relationships to assure their future. That was terrible. I believe that you yourself will agree that even from a mere business point of view, a purely proletarian household establishment, while quite acceptable to me and my wife, or even the girls when they were young, would be unbecoming now. Okay. In November of 1865, his aunt dies. Shocker of all shocks. He's thrilled by this news. This is fantastic news. Oh, alongside the disappointment, one good news. One of my 2 aunts in Frankfurt, the 73-year-old one, the other one is 2 years younger, has passed away. But because she feared that she would die if she made a will, I have therefore to share the inheritance with the other heirs, which would not have been the case if there had been a will, as she did not care for the others. Added to that, the pleasant circumstances that one must wait for the power of attorney from Cape of Good Hope. All these pleasant conditions. He completed his first draft of capital that year in December. That year, so Ginny, his wife, wrote some autobiographical words, and she wrote back about the time where Freddie was born, and I found this interesting. She referred to it as an event I shall not dwell on further, though it brought a great increase in our private and public sorrows. 29 out of 37 of those pages survived being destroyed by family members. I'm sure the other things were glowing regarding her time. 1866. February. You can imagine how opportunely the 10 pounds came. I had received 2 threatening notices, 6 and 9 pence, for swinish municipal taxes. Oh gosh, and he's talking about his carbuncles, his boils. After the receipt of your letter, I took a sharp razor and cut the dog in its own body. I can't bear doctors between or near my sexual organs. I can't. Can you imagine giving this man money and he writes to you about this? Ugh. Okay, so he's super broke. He's taking arsenic and opium for his health. Nice. Surely common at the time. Unfortunately, it didn't kill him yet. August, he wrote a letter to the gentleman who was courting his daughter. This gentleman was biracial, which gave Marx opportunities to make tons of really horrific racial jokes at his expense and try to convince him not to marry his daughter. He was running for some sort of like council office in the town, and he told Ingalls, isn't actually in this book, it's in a different book, that it was really fitting for him to be in charge in that area because that's where the zoo was. That's a racist joke, in case you didn't get that. So this is Paul, the gentleman who married Laura, was born in Santiago de Cuba of a partly French father, and his grandmother had been a Santo Domingo mixed woman, and his paternal grandfather was French. That's why Marx affectionately called him a Creole and sometimes the N-word, which I will not say because I will get kicked off YouTube, and it's a terrible word to call your future son-in-law, but he did try. He did try to convince him not to marry her. Insofar as it is in my power, this is to Paul, I want to protect my daughter from the kind of rocks on which her mother's life has been wrecked. Under these circumstances, you are destined to depend upon others to help in making a common life with my daughter. The audacity to tell this man that he should marry his daughter because he is destined to be dependent, when exactly the same year he's begging for 6 pounds to pay taxes. The audacity. What is he worried about? Keeping up appearances. He is worried about keeping up appearances. So he writes to another friend. He wants money. This is after that letter where he's reviewing being dependent and how gross that is for others. He writes to Ludwig Kugelmann. My economic position has become so bad as a result of my long illness and the many expenses it necessitated that I'm faced with a financial crisis in the immediate future, especially here in London where one must keep up appearances. So he wrote back and was like, I can't help you, but you should ask Ingalls, to which he said back, you misunderstand my relationship with Ingalls, because he'd offered to talk to him, like, oh, I'll talk to him, maybe he'll give you some money, because he doesn't know that he's been sucking at the teat for like decades. He says back to him, he's my most intimate friend. I have no secrets from him. Without him, I would have been compelled to enter some, quote, business, get a job. He literally says, without him, I would have been compelled to get into a business. Hence, under no circumstances do I wish to have any third person intervene with him. Okay, so 1866, where are we now? Oh, another inheritance. Dear Ingalls, You know that the 10 pounds you sent me before you went on your trip were used only to pay taxes. And the 50 pounds later were the prepayment of rent. The so-called inheritance, so this is talking about, I guess, his aunt, had to be divided up among at least 20 people. And so my part, which arrived early this summer, amounted to only 80 pounds. My efforts to raise money in Germany and Holland all failed. This is begging for family members. The pawn shop, and my wife has pawned practically everything, still practically everything, so that she can hardly go out, exists only to collect the interest. Otherwise, the suppliers are threatening, and some creditors have already given me notice and threatened to sue. Is the raising of a loan or some similar transaction possible? Yours, Karl. He was so mad that inheritance wasn't enough. 1867, he's finishing proofs for capital. Again, what made him think he could write about this type of stuff when he could not pay the butcher for his breakfast? He published it in September 14. Ingalls actually wrote some reviews to try and get some interest.
You know, talking about the way that the left is just trying to strangle all speech so only its narrative survives. I'm not kidding about Karl Marx. He was a flagrant racist. You remember we played this clip? Play the clip of, this is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullor. Play that.
We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
So this is a Marxist who founded Black Lives Matter. They're pulling down in Wisconsin last night. They pulled down the statue of an abolitionist. They pulled down the statue of Ulysses S. Grant, who was a great supporter of black freedom. Of course, he destroyed the South in the Civil War, and he helped destroy the Ku Klux Klan in its first iteration. Here's what Marx wrote about a rival socialist. He wrote, "It is now completely clear to me that he, as is proved by his cranial formation and his hair, descends from the Negroes who had joined Moses' exodus from Egypt." He hated the Jews as well, even though he was a Jew. "Assuming that his mother or grandmother on the paternal side had not interbred with an N-word. Now this union of Judaism and Germanism with a basic Negro substance must produce a peculiar product." His co-author, Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto with him, he said of somebody, he was arguing with somebody, and he said, "Being in his quality as an N-word, a degree nearer to the rest of the animal kingdom." So anything they find, if they find one of the founders who helped them get the freedom they have, like George Washington, but they find he was, like all of us, a sinful man, and he was.
But they love Marx. Weird.
The same remorseless attack is made on every historical figure in the West, on every philosopher of the West, every cultural hero of the West. And it's always done the same way. They lived in a time of slavery and did something to endorse it or didn't work against it enough. They lived in a time of colonialism and didn't attack it enough or benefited from it in some way. They were racist by modern standards. This is done against everybody in American history and in British history and Western history, except for Karl Marx.
Weird.
What a coincidence is this?
Very much so.
I took great delight searching the book, finding out the many, many racist things that Karl Marx said. In his private letters to Engels, he constantly uses the N-word, often linked to Jew, profoundly anti-Semitic, of course. Extraordinarily bad views on slavery, on colonialism, everything else. He said much more racist things than any of the people that we've discussed so far.
Very much so. Okay, so 1868, in April, Paul and Laura got married in a civil ceremony. They were atheists. They lied and said they had to get married in a civil service because that Laura was Protestant and he was Catholic. That wasn't true, but they were trying to again save face, which they had said in letters to each other. I love this. In April, Marx told Engels what his mother had said about him, and I just thought this was so spot on. "In a few days, I'll be 50. As that Prussian lieutenant had said to you, already 20 years in the service and still a lieutenant. So I can say, Half a century on my back and still a pauper. How right my mother was. If only Karl had made capital instead of writing about it. That's probably the harshest burn of all time, and it came from his own mother. He has scrotum boils. I'm sorry, I read it, now you read it. Can't pay the butcher, still taking arsenic, and now he starts working on volume 2 of Capital. In November, this is important, Engels sold the family business, got an annual annuity for himself of £800, and forever in the future gave $350 to Marx, saving him from not all of his begging, but most of his begging. These two in the bottom are Paul, the one who, the son-in-law that Marx called an animal, and his daughter. 1869, this is my favorite thing that Karl Marx ever read, or ever wrote, I'm sorry. This is, it made me gasp out loud. Dear Fred Engels, this is July 22nd, 1869. This actually happened. I have had another family unpleasantness. For some time now, I notice that my wife does not make ends meet with the money I give her weekly, although our expenses have not increased in any way. Since I absolutely don't want to get into debt again, and since the money I gave her last Monday was all gone, quote, today, I asked for an explanation. Then the folly of women came out. In the list of debts which she had drawn up for you, she had suppressed about £75, which she has been trying to pay off by and by from her house allowance. I asked why this. Reply, she was afraid to tell me about such a big sum. Women obviously always need a guardian. Can you imagine? I would pillow him in the face if I were her. I mean, I wouldn't be in the situation. I would have pillowed him in the face in like 1830. But just the fact that after a literal lifetime of dependent BS, he wrote that about her, it makes me crazy. 1870, liver pain, abscesses, sciatica. February, Laura and Paul's baby died. April 22nd, just for reference of that year, Lenin was born. Engels moved to London in 1870 in that September, so they saw each other nearly daily. So we don't have as many letters because they didn't need to write letters anymore. 1871 was the Paris Commune. If you, like me, went to public school, you've never heard of it. So give me a moment, we'll play a little video. A little catch up, nothing too long. But again,
the Paris Commune of March to May
1871
is an event of monumental importance in the revolutionary history of class struggle, and specifically for the liberation of the working class. The Commune was the first time that the workers seized the reins of power for themselves and began to democratically administer the affairs of Paris in an embryonic dictatorship of the proletariat. The response from France's supposedly revolutionary republican state was to crush the Commune violently through force of arms just 2 months after its establishment. But through its short existence, the Paris Commune demonstrated that the working class can seize power through its own disciplined action, and can organise society on a socialist basis for the benefit of all. It's for this reason that revolutionaries continue to celebrate and study the Paris Commune. Socialists today can significantly develop their understanding of revolution and the construction of socialist society and the dictatorship of the proletariat by studying the Paris Commune, rather than being any kind of comprehensive history of the
Okay. Yeah. All right.
events of the Commune.
So, after the Paris Commune, we have the First International, during which Mikhail Bakunin, who he met in Paris,
the International Workingmen's Association was founded in London, England in 1864. It was created to coordinate worker struggles across the world, though mainly in Europe, and make demands on the ruling class, such as the 8-hour workday. But right from the first Congress, the International was divided into factions based around anarchists Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Mikhail Bakunin, and around Karl Marx. Louis Napoleon was ruling France at the time, since he came to power in his own version of his uncle's coup of 18th Brumaire. And just like his uncle, Louis Napoleon got himself into wars which eventually ended in his defeat. Only this time, towards the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the workers of Paris took advantage of the lack of central authority and started the Paris Commune.
Which we just learned about.
Which lasted all of a
briefly.
couple months.
Yeah,
but this was a huge deal for the First International, since it was the first practical application of what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. But it also deepened the divide between the anarchists and the Marxists. Marx cited the defeat of the Commune as proof that the working class needs to organize itself in a party and seize political power in order to defeat the bourgeoisie. The anarchists rejected this, stating that their task was to decentralize power. After a majority voted in favor of Marx's idea at the next Congress, they then voted to expel Bakunin, who was secretly organizing his own international. And so, Marxists and anarchists split, leading the newly crowned German Kaiser Otto von Bismarck to exclaim, "Crowned heads, wealth, and privilege may well tremble, should ever again the black and red unite."
Okay. That video is from Marxism Today, and this made me laugh because I'm a petty person. So, use the coupon code Destroy Capitalism for 10% off everything. Okay. 1872. The Russian Tsarist censors missed. So, capital in Russian showed up in Russia. And 3,000 copies were printed and sold that year. So it looked like this horribly boring, long, epic nonsense from this German guy, and they let it go through. So just for reference, it took 5 years for the German copy to sell 1,000. So in Russia, it actually, it sold more. At this point, his daughter Jenny that year married Charles, and this is in 1872. So Bakunin, who was voted out by the people against the anarchists, wrote this letter that I am going to read now because it is unbelievable to me. Okay. So when people say, this isn't the letter, this is me, that Marx isn't responsible for everything that happened because he couldn't have known where his ideology would lead, I cite this. He read this. People told him in his own time what would happen. Okay? And honestly, this is fascinating to me. So this is the beginning. Gentlemen, this is like a letter to the editors. Since you published the sentence of excommunication, which the Marxian Congress of The Hague has just pronounced against me, this is Bakunin talking, you will surely in all fairness publish my reply. Here it is. The triumph of Mr. Marx and his group has been complete, being sure of a majority which they had been long preparing and organizing with a great deal of skill and care, if not with much respect for the principles of morality, truth, and justice, as often found in their speeches and so seldom in their actions. The Marxists took off their masks, and as befits men who love power, and always in the name of that sovereignty of the people, which will from now on serve as a stepping stone for all those who aspire to govern the masses.